Well, Donald Trump's appointment, if we can call it that, of Elon Musk to a government department that does not exist, which they are both now calling the Department of Government Efficiency, does not require Senate confirmation. If it did, Elon Musk would be asked questions about his publicly proclaimed drug use, which is one of the reasons the New York Times breaking news tonight is that Elon Musk has violated the security reporting rules for his and his company's top secret security clearance. If Elon Musk had to submit to a Senate confirmation hearing, he would be asked about an email reported by the New York Times tonight, written by Cody Miller, an Army veteran who worked on security clearances at Elon Musk's company, SpaceX. Just over a month ago, Cody Miller wrote an internal email at that company saying, according to the New York Times, SpaceX has a let's push it till we are caught mentality, Mr. Miller wrote, adding that top executives followed the rules only when convenient for senior leaders. That same day, SpaceX's Human Resources Department called Mr. Miller and pushed him to leave. Three people with knowledge of the company said. Mr. Miller agreed to resign. Pete Hegseth, who still has not secured the votes to be confirmed as Secretary of Defense, has promised that he will quit drinking if and only if he is sworn in as Secretary of Defense. But Elon Musk has not promised to stop using drugs in violation of his top security clearance. Elon Musk had fun smoking pot on a podcast, but that was a violation of his top security clearance. Tulsi Gabbard is not even close to securing enough Republican votes to be confirmed as Director of National Intelligence. Reuters is reporting that 8 Republican senators have doubts about Tulsi Gabbard. Quote, the transition team source and the source familiar with the issue said 8 Republican senators harbored doubts about supporting the former lawmaker because she was unprepared to answer tough questions during an initial round of meetings last week on Capitol Hill. Her failure to address those questions sufficiently, her 2017 visit to Syria to meet then Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, and her lack of significant intelligence experience fueled those concerns, the sources said. In other words, Tulsi Gabbard's meetings with senators have harmed her chances for confirmation, not helped. It only takes 4 Republican senators joining with Democrats to defeat a Trump nomination in the Senate. As of now, Reuters reporting 8 are not there yet, not ready to vote for Tulsi Gabbard. Pete Hegseth there's a poll on Pete Hegseth, according to a recent poll, has the support of only 17% of Americans for confirmation. That means that most Trump voters do not support Pete Hegseth for confirmation as Secretary of Defense. Most Trump voters do not want a Secretary of Defense with a drinking problem so severe that he has decided to promise to stop drinking if he gets the job. Robert Kennedy Jr., who was a heroin addict in college, nodding off in class, didn't take a single pre-med science course in college, not one. He could not have passed a single pre-med science requirement. He is the most unqualified nominee for Secretary of Health and Human Services imaginable. Today, Republican Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, who is no relation to the nominee, who has not yet met with Robert Kennedy, did say something today that Robert Kennedy sharply disagrees with.
Polio vaccine has saved hundreds and hundreds of millions of lives in the world.
Robert Kennedy Jr. disagrees with that completely. He says the polio vaccine has killed more people than any other vaccine, and that is a lie. That's a Kennedy lie. And now, when asked about the polio vaccine in Senate hallways, Robert Kennedy Jr. says this.
Mr. Kennedy, what's your position on the polio vaccine?
Do you mind repeating what you said previously about the polio vaccine?
Do you support it?
Yeah, I support it. Here is what Robert Kennedy said about the polio vaccine last year.
There's no vaccine that is, safe and effective.
Those are big words. What about the polio?
Words.
Can we talk about the?
Well, here's the problem.
Yes.
Here's the problem. 98 million people who got that vaccine in my generation got it, and now you've had this explosion of soft tissue cancers in our generation that kill many, 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 many more people than polio ever did. So if you say to me that the polio vaccine was effective against polio, I'm going to say yes. And if you say to me, did it kill more people, did it cause more deaths than avert, I would say, I don't know, because we don't have the data on that.
That uneducated buffoon did not take a single pre-med science course in college. He could never get through organic chemistry or inorganic chemistry. And in the class I was in with him in college, he could not keep his eyes open. I did not know then that he was a heroin addict every day he was in college. He has said he was a heroin addict for 14 years. And while he was a heroin addict, his powerful uncle, Senator Ted Kennedy, managed to get him a job in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. And while he was working for the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, he was committing drug crimes every day, for which he was finally arrested, charged, and convicted. And that is who Donald Trump wants to be Secretary of Health and Human Services. A science ignoramus who was in a heroin stupor every day that he could have been studying science in college. It is no surprise that the heroin addict, convicted criminal, turned self-described medical expert does not have the votes yet to be confirmed by the United States Senate. Republican Senator Mitch McConnell, himself a polio survivor who suffered from polio early in his life, issued this statement saying, "The polio vaccine has saved millions of lives and held out the promise of eradicating a terrible disease. Efforts to undermine public confidence in proven cures are not just uninformed, they're dangerous." Robert Kennedy Jr. has always been a danger to himself and others. In its breaking news reporting tonight, the New York Times says, quote, Elon Musk and his rocket company SpaceX have repeatedly failed to comply with federal reporting protocols aimed at protecting state secrets, including by not providing some details of his meetings with foreign leaders, according to people with knowledge of the company and internal documents. The Air Force also recently denied Mr. Musk a high-level security access, citing potential security risks associated with the billionaire. Several allied nations, including Israel, have also expressed concerns that he could share sensitive data with others, according to defense officials. The Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency, which is in charge of vetting individuals seeking access to classified information, took more than 2 years, an atypical length that was more than double the average time, to approve Mr. Musk's top security clearance. 3 people with knowledge of the matter said. During that period, Mr. Musk was filmed on Joe Rogan's podcast, Smoking Pot, which remains illegal at the federal level and is prohibited under security clearance rules. His business interest in China, where Tesla has a factory, were also a concern, the people familiar with the matter said. In August 2023, Mr. Musk wrote on X that he took ketamine, an anesthetic with psychedelic properties, when his brain chemistry sometimes goes super negative. He has said he has a prescription for the drug. Any drug use is supposed to be disclosed to the Defense Department, but SpaceX and Mr. Musk did not report it at the time, 3 people with knowledge of the company said. Around that time, the Air Force denied Mr. Musk a high-level security access, the so-called Special Access Program status, which is reserved for extremely sensitive classified programs. 4 people with knowledge of the rejection said. SpaceX executives assured the Defense Department that they kept Mr. Musk out of the most sensitive classified discussions, the officials said. Yet Pentagon officials remain concerned that Mr. Musk has joined some meetings where such matters were discussed, even without the special clearance, the official said.
Ari Melber is MSNBC's chief legal correspondent, the host of The Beat with Ari Melber, and he joins me now. Good to see you, man.
Great to see you.
Okay, what's your the Seltzer lawsuit feels like one of those sort of like press release dressed up as a lawsuit at one level. At another level, there really has been a worrying trend in the gates opening and judges letting more of these forward. How do you take it?
The suing of a pollster for a poll you didn't like in a field where polls, when done right, have a variation is completely frivolous unless through discovery you find some new consumer fraud plot. Right. They have not yet shown that evidence.
There has been, it's not just Robinson, it's not just Trump. We've seen Elon Musk go after Media Matters with the lawsuit. And I want to be clear here, like we're a little biased because we're reporters, and I generally think the free press is important, and I think the standard for defamation should be high. Also, there are legitimate instances of defamation, and it's important for people not to be defamed and for us to get it right and do our best to get it right. In general, what do you make of this sort of lawsuit fuselage coming from Trump?
Well, one, you're right about the disclosures, so we can be honest with the audience about that. We have an expertise about this as journalists, but we have a view that journalism is a good thing that should flourish and not be stomped out. And you can add to that, I practiced First Amendment law when I used to litigate, so you can say all of that. I have defended journalists' rights in this arena. Having said all that, there is a way to look at this, hopefully, for what's good for the country. And it has been a nonpartisan, long tradition dating back to the Fourth Estate of the founders' verbiage that this was key to the facts and sunlight of a democracy and common facts. It's very clear that there's a deliberate, orchestrated strategy here. I thought your report showed many of the key aspects, which was excellent. Rachel has tracked Peter Thiel, who funded anonymous lawsuits against journalists years ago and even ended up bankrupting Gawker, which, whatever its sins, and the courts did find mistakes, it was a corporate death penalty for a mistake in journalism. And so there's a big question here about, A, what they want to do, whether win or lose, to chill, as you've reported. And then, B, we should keep an eye on this. There are a lot of right-wing figures who want to bring the key First Amendment case here that protects journalists and has a high standard for reporting on public officials in the government. They want to get it to the Supreme Court, which means they might like a Trump-related loss that they can appeal all the way to Trump's Supreme Court.
This is really key. So first of all, the context here is that Trump's been doing this forever. This is what he does. In the 1980s, he was a real estate developer. He sued the Chicago Tribune when its architecture writer described his proposed Manhattan skyscraper as ugly monstrosity. The suit was dismissed. He lost defamation suits against media groups, including CNN and NY and the New York Times. Now, a critic saying something's an ugly monstrosity is like core First Amendment speech. Like, it must be the case.
It's what protects Donald Trump's rights to insult so many people in public.
Exactly, which, again, core protected. But your point about, so you've got a bunch of people, Thiel, Musk, and Trump, this is the way they want to go after the press. The worrying thing is what judges are doing with it. And the key case, if you could explain to people, which is Sullivan, which sets the standard, legendary case. We already have Clarence Thomas, I think, on the record in some dissents being like, Sullivan's wrong, we should overrule it. Conservative judges maybe looking at that, looking to get sort of teed up a case to open the floodgates to this kind of thing.
Yeah, this is the key case that gives reporters in America and others talking about public figures such robust rights. Other countries don't necessarily have this. You might have narrower free speech, and it's from a civil rights era ruling that basically found that it's a higher standard to actually be sued out of existence or end up paying big amounts when you are reporting on discussing public figures, that you have to basically prove that a statement was not only false, but it was knowingly false, a lie, or made so recklessly that you didn't even check it out.
Right.
And this is where your expertise comes in. You, the team at All In, MSNBC reporters, the ABC reporters, if you want to take folks who are not us, do a great deal of work all day to fact-check things to the best of their ability before it makes air. And if they make a mistake, then they try to correct it. And a little footnote, if I may, on the ABC case that may interest people. I thought you did a very precise job of referring to the underlying facts. Even after settling, and we could debate whether ABC should have settled what many lawyers thought was a winnable case, but people settle for different reasons. You'll notice the statement they agreed upon, along with paying this money back, did not refer in ABC's agreed statement to a falsehood. It said, we regret the statements. And that's the deal they struck. And so that's another big difference is most reputable outlets, if we find out something's false, we correct it. They didn't do that then, And again, other people can debate it. We're all here to discuss. But their statement said we regret the statements.
And if I'm not mistaken, and man, I hope I'm not, as I'm about to say this on live TV, since we just had this conversation, the plaintiffs in Sullivan were folks that did not like the New York Times coverage of the civil rights, in what was going on in terms of civil rights movements
and there
in
was
the South.
Publishing of, and you get into real deep First Amendment issues like, are you publishing information or reporting when you're publishing names of people involved in the struggle or in the donations?
Right. So you've got this protection there, the court, we don't know what's happened. You've got these civil lawsuits, which I think we're going to see. Then there's the thing he says, which is, I wish the Justice Department should have done it.
Yeah,
but that's left to me. So that's the other big question where we're heading towards.
They ought to do something really melts into we.
Right. And that would be pretty unprecedented. I mean, I don't think we've seen a Justice Department go after the free press, either civilly or criminally. Certainly not in my lifetime, not for a long time. Ari Melber, of course, host of The Beat, weekdays at 6 p.m. right here on MSNBC. It's great to have you.
Great to see you.
Joining us now is NBC's Hala Gourani and Mark Polymeropoulos, former chief of operations in Europe and Eurasia at the CIA and an NBC News national security intelligence analyst. So, Hala, good morning. This is really kind of significant. What happened here?
Very significant. This is a very high-level officer in Moscow, and basically the Ukrainians have taken the war to the heart of the Russian capital with that remotely detonated bomb that was hidden, we understand, in a scooter. So Igor Kirillov, a 54-year-old, in fact, he was born in 1970, is the head of that unit that you mentioned there of weapons of mass destruction, of biological and nuclear warfare. And the Ukrainians are saying that essentially his unit participated in that Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and was responsible for causing a lot of damage and deaths inside of Ukraine, and that they considered, therefore, this lieutenant general to be a legitimate target. Now, we haven't had reaction from the Ministry of Defense, but we've had an outpouring of condolence messages from various politicians and agencies inside of Russia. As far as Ukraine is concerned, as I mentioned, Jose, they're saying this is a legitimate target. This is somebody who was deeply involved in the war effort inside of Ukraine after the invasion in 2022. It's a very bold move. This is something that is going to resonate with residents of Moscow and across Russia as well. We're not now talking about actions on the border areas, right on side of the Russian side of the border with Ukraine, but we're talking deep into the Russian state. And Ukrainians, of course, are all just in the next few weeks waiting for what will President-elect Donald Trump's the fact that he's going to be taking office soon, will it mean for U.S. support of the Ukrainian effort against Russia militarily as that war grinds on, Jose?
Hala Gourani, I thank you very much. So, Mark, and Hala was saying this is an extremely bold move. Indeed, it was. I mean, Ukrainian security service sources say that a scooter laced with explosives was detonated, killing these two people in the streets of Moscow. How did Ukraine pull this off, and how bold of a move was it?
So, Jose, Hala's right. This is an extraordinary operation. This is called a high-value target op. In essence, it's a find, fix, and finish mission. What is amazing is this entails the Ukrainians having recruited sources not only inside of Russia, inside of Moscow. That's an agent network. That's individuals who would carry out surveillance with a pattern of life of the target, who would then employ the explosive and then call the target out. And so that is really an extraordinary breach of what many consider a denied area. And this is going to be deeply embarrassing to Vladimir Putin, absolutely humiliating the Russian security services, because it shows that Ukraine has this reach, again, not just into Russia, but into the heart of Moscow and against high-value targets. Really an impressive operation, in my old, business, but something I think that will resonate very deeply within the Russian national security infrastructure.
And Mark, so the fact that it was essentially a glorified IED, I mean, that's essentially what this was, right? And even though what I think what makes it extremely significant is, as you say, it was in a denied area. What do you mean by a denied area? And how difficult is it to get something like an IED into a denied area?
Right. There's thousands of Russian security personnel in Moscow. A denied area means there is a pervasive, security state that watches everyone's moves, whether it's camera systems, whether it's informants. And for Western intelligence services and for the Ukrainians as well, this is an area that's very difficult to operate. So by recruiting sources inside who can operate there, that shows a level of penetration of Russian security that I think is something that is quite noteworthy. And again, as you noted, they actually have to not only observe the target, but they have to smuggle in the explosives. Then they have to detonate this. This apparently was detonated remotely in a scooter, but that means individuals on the ground. So I think there's going to be a very severe, counterintelligence operation by Russian security. The heads will roll as well. And then the last piece is we are going to see, as Hala noted, kind of there's been a ferocious reaction from the Russians. There will be some retaliation, probably, unfortunately, in the form of strikes in Ukraine against civilian targets.
And, what can Ukraine expect? Is it, Mark, that a retaliation of this magnitude would include more than just increased missile strikes on what they've unfortunately been doing for years now, which is destroying parts of the, civilian infrastructure in Ukraine? But could it lead to maybe some targeting, pinpoint attacks on Ukrainian leaders?
So, the Russians have tried, but the Ukrainians, of course, their security services are very good. I think, no doubt, Vladimir Putin and his security apparatus would like to do this. They just have not been able to. So I think the default mechanism will be just kind of more mass casualty events against the Ukrainians. But let's also note one thing as well, is that the Ukrainians, have been very worried, of course, of the incoming Trump administration, what they're going to do about the kind of flagging European support. This operation will be celebrated inside of Ukraine. There's going to be some satisfaction there that they're still in the fight. And I think that psychological piece is going to be quite important.
So what does that tell you, if anything, of what was the NKVD, what was the Soviet system, and what has become the Russian interior control and monitoring system?
So, they're good, but maybe they're not that good. And that the Ukrainians are able to penetrate them is amazing. So this is the first, the most senior Russian military official, security official killed. The Ukrainians have struck before. Several years ago, they took a shot at a Russian propagandist, ended up killing his daughter. But again, it shows that this all-pervasive security state in Moscow might not be as almighty, all-powerful as we think. And that is going to resonate inside Russia as well. It's going to resonate inside the Russian security apparatus, because they now know that no one is safe.
The current president still has all the executive power of any president, even though they call it a lame duck. That means he's handing over power in January, but he has all the powers. They're not reviewable, some of the executive powers, not even by the Supreme Court. And Biden officials are mulling what could be a comprehensive plan to stop much of Trump's DOJ and FBI revenge plot, which I just showed you. This is a plan that could legally completely thwart the vows to abuse federal law enforcement and prosecution, to Trump-proof any potential misuse of authority. And if it is done broadly, I can tell you as a lawyer and legal reporter, it could checkmate and stop future federal probes in their tracks in the next Trump term. For real. Here's how it would work. President Biden would point to this ample evidence that Trump is already expressing a desire, an intent to abuse power, to illicitly prosecute people who have not broken any law, naming political targets, demanding jail without even the pretense of naming a crime or respecting any investigation. So that would be an argument that he's already targeting democracy, free speech, and vowing what could be a legal selective prosecution. And two, President Biden could say this new threat, admitted by the president-elect, is unprecedented. And three, that the Supreme Court granted the incoming president new immunity for official acts, past and future. So President Biden could, under this plan, and I'm telling you, it is a pretty wide, sweeping, bold plan, but the idea would be President Biden could answer the Supreme Court with lawful action of his own, creating new legal terrain in response to new legal terrain. And here's how it would work. I told you, plain English. Under this plan, President Biden could grant his own immunity to people who serve the country in any branch of government, in any party, who now face this documented threatened prosecution. The argument is, facing unprecedented moves by the court and the president-elect vowing these big moves, that would require an unprecedented protection of public servants. Indeed, the Biden White House could literally quote from the Supreme Court immunity ruling about how officials need some immunity from future prosecution to do their jobs. Biden could thwart a probe of Cheney or Jack Smith or other government veterans on any MAGA enemies list, quote unquote. He could do it with this comprehensive lawful use of the pardon power, issuing new preemptive pardons to stop the kind of DOJ prosecutions I just showed you they're threatening. Remember, federal probes are predicated on investigating a federal crime. If the so-called politically made-up crimes here are already pardoned, boom, you're pulling that crime right out of the legal process. If there's no threat of conviction and jail at the end of that probe, it's been pre-pardoned, then there's not much federal action there. Now, these are uncharted waters. The incoming president knows he has the immunity that he got supersized by the Supreme Court and is vowing to abuse power. An immunity that's broader, really, than anyone's seen before, with a guy making threats that go way past Nixon. So the Biden plan to preempt the abuse of those probes and thwart these revenge cases is on the table. Biden could legally do it alone. Unlike many other things you hear about, Congress and the courts are not involved in these executive pardon clemency powers. And Biden aides are reportedly considering a version of this plan. We don't know how narrow or broad. It has been reported sometimes in narrow terms. A couple of pardons here or there, or you could hit the whole enemies list, or write something broad enough to protect, like I said, people who served in government that are facing basically the kind of attacks that the Supreme Court said they should be immune from, at least in the presidential example. And all legal roads seem to lead back to January 6th. That's because Trump and Patel and these others are on a mission to try to undo what remains the greatest democracy crisis in the last century and you can tell from the way they act, the greatest problem for Donald Trump, the worst thing he's done, according to many Republicans. We've played the quotes here. So they want to basically try to reverse that convicted sedition in mind and law. And you should note, when I say all roads lead back, this pardon reporting includes exploring pardons for basically creating a type of immunity for leaders of the Jan 6 committee who faced tremendous pressure. You see Schiff and Cheney and others, Milley, who spoke out. And that would be dealing with pardons in both parties. Now, what you're hearing in this reporting is the news. The White House is considering this, and what I just mentioned, the arguments by advocates, people for this. I can also report for you that some legal experts who are well outside of MAGA also oppose this plan to Trump-proof the DOJ that I just told you about. There are Washington observers who say it just carries the risk of implying guilt to the very people who were doing the honest, good investigative work in the government, that it could set a dangerous precedent. There are lawyers who argue this is not the right way to protect long-term DOJ independence, nor present the nation with any kind of clarity. Indeed, that's a DOJ vet, Sarah Isgur, who's been rumored among some of these lists saying, I don't want the pardon even if you offered it, because it's not the right way to do it. President Biden has weeks now to decide yes or no to a plan that's clearly being considered.
The flashing lights from thousands of reported drone sightings across the Northeast may be coming into clearer focus. Over the weekend, an FBI official said there had been more than 5,000 reported sightings, but only 100 warranted review. The vast majority appear to have been planes, helicopters, and legitimate drone operations, though President-elect Trump today suggested the government or military knows more about the drones than they're saying.
Something strange is going on. For some reason, they don't want to tell the people.
As of tonight, federal and state authorities still have no answer regarding the drones that have been reportedly spotted hovering over New Jersey, New York, and neighboring states. Today, the House Intelligence Committee received a classified briefing on the drone sightings. And directly afterward, Ranking Member Jim Himes said that there is neither an imminent threat nor is there evidence that the drone operators are foreign actors. At the same time, Hyams also said the culprit is not the federal government.
We spent a lot of time in this hearing asking the question in every way imaginable as to whether or not any of these sightings in New Jersey, Connecticut, anywhere they're being cited, are federal government operations. And they are not. We were assured, and we asked this question over and over and over again. They are not federal government operations to sniff radiation, gas, recovery, anything else.
Joining me now is Congresswoman Mikey Sherrill, who's a Democrat of New Jersey. She has also recently announced that she is running for governor of that state. Congresswoman, it's great to have you here. I am eager to get your thoughts on this. Everyone's saying nothing to see here, but of course there's maybe everything to see here. Do you think the public is going to get any access to some of the declassified information that has made some Congress people feel so confident that this is not an alien invasion?
Right. Certainly. And I'm going to continue to push for more information to come out. I had a White House briefing today, largely unclassified. And I think here's what we know right now. New Jersey is a very crowded airspace. There certainly are drones over the New Jersey airspace. There are aircraft. There are even planets that some people have cited and said they were drones. What we now have is very sophisticated radars on the ground to make sure that we can track these better. And we also have much of our law enforcement utilizing software so that they can tell, as people report to them, what the aircraft patterns are in the area and what people might be looking at, and determine if further investigation is warranted. So this is all good news. And I think it really is something that the people of New Jersey are hearing and feeling a little bit better about. The frustration remains, though, that it took us about a month to get to this point. That's unacceptable. There still seems to be a lack of communication. I was just having that White House briefing today, and I was reporting some information on the base in my district, and Pat Ryan was reporting information on the base in his district. We're both military veterans, so we've been focused on some of the national security implications, and it seemed as if the White House might have been unaware of some of the information we were presenting to them, but we've presented it before. So the communication still does not seem to be operating where we want it to be operating. And it isn't clear to me that all of the information that the government's collated is being brought together and then dispersed to law enforcement on the ground. I'm still hearing on the ground some lack of information. And finally, we know the communication to the public is simply not where it needs to be. It has gotten better, but there is still work to be done. And it is for all of these reasons that I have been pushing out a plan. I'm happy to see that the first step, getting these radars on the ground, has been accomplished. We are seeing more communications. We are getting more briefings in Congress. Again, things that I think need to immediately happen. I would still like to see an agency in charge of interagency operations. And I still want to see a future plan for the future dealing with drones like this.
Okay, but just to get to the essence of what may be happening here, is your assessment based on the information that you have and that you've been privy to and that you can share with us, that this is just, I'll read with this is a joint statement from 4 government agencies, DHS, FBI, the Federal Aviation Administration, and DOD. We assess that the sightings to date include a combination of lawful commercial drones, hobbyist drones, and law enforcement drones, as well as manned fixed-wing aircrafts, helicopters, and stars mistakenly reported as drones. Is it just that the notion of drones everywhere is out there and the public is seeing them where, otherwise it might not? This is effectively business as usual. Is that your assessment of this?
I think we've heard from law enforcement agencies and military personnel that they have seen concerning drones. We've seen operations shut down on some of the military bases, some because drones, and they could be any number of these types of drones that we just saw listed, have gotten in the way of a flight path. So while I still, while I take their point, while I'm very glad these radars are on the ground and these are specific to tracking drones and we are getting more information, I still feel as if there is a lack of information on specific events and there is a lack of information on exactly what happened and an understanding of if these government agencies are communicating to the full extent they need to be. So I feel better after having received the briefings I've had and what I've heard about some of what's going on. I don't feel like we are at the point where every sighting I have had a report back that it is, in fact, either a law enforcement drone, a hobbyist drone, or aircraft or something that we would expect to be in the sky. So that is problem A. And I'm still working to get to the bottom of that, and we are slowly getting there. Problem B, it took far too long to get to this point. And problem C is I don't think we have the plan going forward in the future, which is why I sketched out a plan. I have the plan. We have to go forward in a more rapid way in the future.
Yes, especially because the aliens move pretty quickly. I'm kidding. We know they're not aliens.
we have no evidence of that. No evidence of aliens.
That's what we wanted to hear from you. And honestly, also, you feel better. The fact that you are saying you feel better makes me feel better. And that you at least have a plan also makes me feel better. And probably a lot of other people out there. All my friends who've been texting me about what is going on with the drones, just listen to Congresswoman Cheryl. She's on it. Thank you so much for your time tonight. It's great to hear from you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Donald Trump ran for president for one reason and one reason only, to make all of his legal problems, poof, go away. And for the most part, he was successful, with one exception. Yesterday, the New York judge who presided over Trump's hush money trial denied his bid to toss out his guilty verdict, meaning Trump will have to live with the infamy of being the first convicted felon president. And yes, MAGA, you are still a convicted felon before you are sentenced. That's how it works. But that isn't stopping Trump from trying to hit the delete button on every other bad headline ever printed about him, going so far as to sue Iowa pollster Ann Seltzer and the Des Moines Register, saying he's seeking accountability for brazen election interference over a November poll that showed Kamala Harris up 3% in Iowa. Never mind the fact that Trump won the election and won the state of Iowa by double digits. He's clearly feeling emboldened by ABC News agreeing to pay a $15 million settlement in a defamation lawsuit. Nearly every legal expert said that they would have won. And as others in the media show, they are increasingly willing to comply in advance, like the owner of the LA Times, Patrick Soon-Shiong, who Oliver Darcy is reporting requested that the newspaper's editorial board outright take a break from writing about Trump and balance any critical editorials or articles with positive ones. Yeah, but here's the thing. These CEOs who are thinking, let me just give him what he wants this one time and he'll leave me alone. He won't hurt me or my company, or he'll give me goodies like tax cuts or tariff exemptions or federal contracts, a pat on the head. That is not how it works with Trump. His ego is too fragile and his needs are endless. As any parent knows, if your toddler is having a tantrum in the middle of the grocery store, the solution isn't to just buy them the cookies they're screaming for, because then they'll just do it again and again, and you'll be out of money and sanity, and their teeth will be rotten. And right now, Trump is that toddler, and he wants nothing short of complete obedience and constant adulation for everyone to say they love him and praise him and tell him he's the best president ever. And it'll never be obsequious enough or vigorous enough. He'll always want more and punish and humiliate even those who do comply. Just ask Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, and all the black Republicans who went to the mat for Trump during the campaign only to get snubbed as he builds his administration. He will always reward weakness with more humiliation. And that includes foreign leaders like Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who went to Mar-a-Lago last month to kiss the ring, behaving like Trump was already president, which he's not. And how does Trump reward him? By publicly mocking Trudeau on his social media site, once again calling Trudeau the governor of the great state of Canada. Joining me now is Tim O'Brien, senior executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion and MSNBC political analyst. And I have to tell you, this Trudeau thing really bothered me. Let me just put up this tweet that Trudeau posted on, why is he still on X Twitter? But he posted this tweet of himself. Look at me next to Donald. Look, what is he doing? When will people learn, Tim, that emasculating yourself before Trump, as Ted Cruz did, as so many have done, doesn't help and just makes him worse?
And it's also, a reminder, Joy, that he has been this way forever. He came up, as you know, and as I know, and we've talked many times, at the knee of Roy Cohn, who taught him how to weaponize the legal system. And he's learned that you don't necessarily need to go to court, and you don't necessarily need to ultimately break people if they're scared enough in the first innings of any action you take to capitulate, whether they're politicians, members of the business community, members of the media, members of Congress, or members of the judiciary. And we can pull down examples of each and every one of these institutions and some of their leading members deciding in advance that the safest way and the most productive way to deal with Donald Trump is to kiss the ring. And we see example after example of once they do that, he then shames them in public.
Yes.
And he is not ultimately delivering on some of the things they want. And he does it to the people he even holds close to them. I mean, think about how many days was it after RFK Jr. got nominated, for HHS, and there was a picture of him eating fast food with Don Jr. and Donald on the presidential plane. Eat your food, take your punishment. And for Trudeau, who you set up in your previous clip in the introduction of this segment, his own government is fractured because of this. And he could very well be out of a job because of this. So I do think that people in the near term right now are petrified. They're not sure how to respond to the fact that Trump was reelected again, other than to capitulate. But they should keep, I think, their eyes on the prize.
Well, I mean, and there's sort of a game people play of mocking Canada. Well, now Canada has been mocked by its own prime minister. Justin Trudeau went down to Mar-a-Lago as if Trump is already president. He's not president yet. He didn't go running to the White House of the real current president. He went to him as if he could just become a supplicant. And now Chrystia Freeland, who is his finance minister, she's out of there because she's like, we need to come up with a strategy to deal with Trump's tariff plan. That is not a strategy, and it is humiliating. And if I were a Canadian, I'd be absolutely disgusted. It's interesting that it's said that there's a crisis of manhood, right? That is being said a lot on the right. There is a crisis of manhood. But it's on your own side, guys. It's people like Jeff Bezos. It's people like Mark Zuckerberg. Is this manly behavior to go and fall on your knees to Donald Trump? No. I want to show you one reason why people might be doing it, though. Los Angeles Times wrote this. I'm sorry, not Los Angeles Times. Apologize to that. Robert Reich wrote this. Much better. He says that part of the reason the media is doing this, no large American corporation wants to be actively litigating against a sitting president, especially one as vindictive as Trump. A $15 million settlement is chicken feed compared to the myriad ways Trump could penalize Disney, which is a $205.25 billion corporation that has other businesses besides the media. So talk a little bit about that, because some of these media are actually owned by bigger conglomerates with other business that could be before the president. And so he wants to save, his SpaceX and wants to save his other thing, or not SpaceX, whichever one is his. Bezos is one. Everyone's thinking about their other businesses,
Blue Origins, I think, is
Blue
Bezos'
Origin for Bezos. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think that this is, in the American media model, it has always depended on the integrity of the owners because they're privately held concerns for the most part, unless or publicly traded, but with close ownership. PBS is the only media entity of note that isn't, and there's some very powerfully funded nonprofits like ProPublica that do wonderful work. But when we talk about the legacy media and the mainstream media, we're talking about corporate media. And in the era we're in now, corporations have multiple interests that aren't only tied to their media holdings, and their CEOs are thinking about those things. And I think you're seeing some media owners decide to dispose of media assets because it's troublesome. I think you have others doing anticipatory knee bending because they don't want to go into battle in a courtroom with the president. It's bottom line thinking, it's strategic thinking, but it's not journalistic, and it's not tied to the idea, just that core basic idea that the role of journalists in the world should be to seek the truth and hold the powerful accountable on behalf of the public interest.
Yeah, at this point, the Los Angeles Times is essentially saying if you report a negative fact about Trump, you have to balance it with a positive fact. I'm not sure how that is serving journalists, and I can tell you that people inside the Los Angeles Times, apparently, at least allegedly, according to the reports, are not happy. And inside of Bezos' operation, it's difficult in this moment when you just want to do the journalism. It's difficult. But Tim O'Brien, we always appreciate you, our Trump expert. Thank you very much.